I know it's a difficult habit to get back into again after all these months of Zooms and other types of video. But we are really determined to try and get back to normal as much as possible. And I think one of the highlights of our in-person semesters has always been talks by invited speakers from other schools where they can come and tell us something new, and the luxury of sitting there for an hour and learning something new is something to be appreciated. So I'm really glad you're all here, and as we go through the semester, hopefully we'll get better and better in terms of our attendance. And I want to give a little bit of context to today's talk. And I'm sure almost all of you are familiar with this idea of the negative impact of social media in a lot of different ways. So there is the personality issues with people using Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and other types of social media. And also, there's lots of harassment online, and lots of studies have also shown that many of these algorithms actually come with some biases. And the reason they have the biases is because they were made by people. And so that's what it is. And they're creating problems. And given how quickly all of these things are moving in terms of becoming integral to our lifestyles, I think we need to address a lot of these bigger issues. So this is at the interface of computer science and humanities. So this is called digital social sciences, or there are a number of different names for it. And we are also, as a department and a college, we are also trying to move into that arena of human-computer interactions. And we want to hire some people in computer science and also in psychology and humanities to have them, like I say, to lock them in a room and throw away the key to force them to collaborate, to come up with bigger picture ideas, right? Any one person studying any of these aspects, thank you. Am I not loud enough?
No.
Oh, is it on already? Is it on? Oh, it is. Okay. Anyway, so we are very excited to explore that area of research. I think there's great contributions to be made, and which is really the reason I'm very excited to have our today's speaker, Dr. Florian Schaub. He comes from School of Information at the University of Michigan, and he also has an appointment at Electrical and Computer Science Department at Michigan. Florian did his bachelor's in information technology from Deakin University in Australia, and then he went on to get his doctoral degree from Ulm University in Germany in computer science. And then he went on to do a postdoctoral fellowship at Carnegie Mellon University. And after that, he came and joined University of Michigan. He has several different fields of interest. Of course, broadly speaking, human-computer interactions. But he also does information and communication technology and how it impacts social change. He was also interested in science, technology, and society. Ubiquitous computing, that's another issue that's emerging. Digital access, it's very, very uneven. And that became very clear when the pandemic started, because we suddenly realized there is a huge proportion of school students who don't have access to computers, which many of us take for granted. So that's an inequity that needs to be addressed. And one way to do that is with a combination of computer science knowledge and humanities. He's written many, many peer-reviewed articles, and he's been quoted in a number of different news sources, such as Wall Street Journal, New York Times, New Scientist, BBC, etc. So I'm really, really pleased to have Florian here to speak with us about privacy, in case you still have some. Thank you. Welcome.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my first in-person talk, I think, since like November 2019. So, walking up a stage is definitely a muscle memory that has to come back, but it's great to be here. And let's talk about a fun topic today, right? Like, is technology killing privacy? And maybe we should start by what is privacy? We're intimate group here. Anyone want to shout what they think is privacy?
Stuff that's not public.
Stuff that's not public. Okay, yeah, close, right? So that's in 1890. Samuel Warren and future Supreme Court Justice Lauren Brandeis wrote an article where they basically said that, right? There needs to be a right to be let alone. And anyone want to guess what stipulated them to argue for a right to be let alone? It was technology. Right? The invention of the Kodak snap camera. All of a sudden, you could take photos when people were not just posing for like 5-10 minutes until the picture came out sharp. Right? You could just take a snap photo of someone, in a lewd position or just unprepared. And what they were worried about is reputation, right? And how technology can impact reputation. And now, when we talk about modern privacy, we mostly talk about information privacy, right? Like, how is privacy impacted by information technology? And Alan Weston is one of the leading scholars in this field. He's not with us anymore, but he defined information privacy as the right of individuals to control, edit, manage, and delete information about themselves, and to decide when, how, and to what extent information is communicated to others. Want to guess what stipulated him to formulate that? Say it with me, technology. The advent of the mainframe computers and the ability at that time for government agencies to actually start gathering information and processing information in unprecedented ways, right? Like all of a sudden you can have the machine do the computation for you. And that created lots of concern, even back then. I really like this quote from the US Privacy Protection Study Commission's report. The real danger is the gradual erosion of individual liberties through automation, integration, and interconnection of many small, separate record-keeping systems, each of which alone may seem innocuous, even benevolent, and wholly justifiable. Right? And that trend has continued, right? Like, yes, there might be like the really big, bad surveillance databases that we all know about, but privacy is gradually eroding through technological progress. And I like technology, I'm not against technology, just to put that out there, right? We're gonna talk about how we can reconcile those things. So before I talk more about the actual implications, let's talk about why do we need privacy. Anyone have an idea, why do we need privacy? Reduce identity theft, yeah. Quality of life, right. These are all great points, right. Privacy serves many different purposes. Intimacy, being yourself, learning who you are as a student, right. When you're a student, many people discover who they really are and what their identity is. That only works if you're not under constant scrutiny of who you are. Having autonomy about your decisions, who you congregate with. Having autonomy over your thoughts, right? Political discourse, dissent only can thrive if there's privacy. But what privacy isn't is just secrecy. Right? Like sometimes it's like, oh, if you want privacy, you've got something to hide. That's a problem. And I like this quote from Edward Snowden. He says, well, if you say you don't care about privacy because you've got nothing to hide, it's like saying you don't care about free speech because you've got nothing to say. Right? And the core here is really that it's not so much about whether you need privacy at this particular moment, it's having the ability to have privacy when you need it. Right? And if you want to dive deeper, then Daniel Soloff has written a whole book about the nothing to hide fallacy and how one of the big errors we often make is that we pit against each other societal security interests, national security interests with individual privacy, right? And we kind of neglect the societal and social value of privacy and how it creates that space for quality of life, for self-discovery, self-expression, and also political discourse. So today we kind of see privacy under fire from all kinds of directions, right? We have safety, law enforcement, national security interests that want to collect more data about individuals. We have business interests that try to monetize data of individuals. We have technological advancement that actually creates more and more data about individuals. But then we as humans are also not particularly great at protecting our privacy, right? Like privacy is at tension with other interests. We want to, like I'm from Germany, I'm German, right? I frequently talk to my family in Germany, and I cherish that, right? Like the ability to make video calls is a lifesaver in these days, right? So we want to socialize, we want to show who we are, who we like to pretend to be to the world. We also value the convenience, right, of technology. But all these things are kind of at tension. And one area where we see this especially is social media, right? Was just mentioned. Many people post things on social media in different areas. What we see a lot is context collapse. This idea that something that's meant for a certain for certain people, is actually available to the whole world. And that can be embarrassing sometimes, like when your parents start commenting on your Facebook posts. But it can also go, can be really damaging, right? So I don't know if you remember this case, it's from 2015, but this woman, Justine Sacco, she stepped on a plane to South Africa, and before she turned off her phone, she tweeted, "Going to Africa, hope I don't get AIDS. Just kidding, I'm white." Turned off her phone, left. At this point, she had 170 Twitter followers. We can probably all agree that's a bit of a tone-deaf tweet, right? Quite racist. But while she was flying, over these 11 hours, that tweet got reshared, got thousands of angry responses. And by the time she landed in South Africa, she not only had a phone that was blowing up, but she had also been fired from her job. Because she was a PR person, and that didn't quite go with what a PR person should represent, at least for the company fired her. Let me say that again. When she turned off her phone, she had 170 Twitter followers. Right? She thought she was talking to 170 people, but while she was in the air, the whole world had a conversation with her. So, but I also want to make clear, when we talk about privacy, it's not just about the information you actually post or share, right? Like that's where you need to kind of like think a little bit, make sure you're not oversharing. But it's also about the traces you leave behind when you use technology. So simple example, right? Website analytics. When you go to a website and you look at it, almost all websites have analytics. They try to see like, are you bouncing from this page, right? Bounce rates is a really important term of art in the industry. Like trying to figure out where do you basically jump off? Why didn't you complete that transaction? The problem from a privacy perspective is that these services, or the analytic services, are largely provided by two companies at this point. There was a study in 2016 by Princeton researchers. They looked at the top 1 million websites, and they found that Google Analytics was present on 75% of them. And Facebook Analytics was present on 25% of them. It's probably higher by now. Now, what that means is that while the website learns interesting and important things about its customers, Google holistically can follow you from website to website and can create a very detailed picture of who you are as you use the web. And we see this not just with online analytics, we see this with online tracking, right? So when you go to a website, you read a news article. Kudos to the New York Times for actually publishing an article that called out their bad practices. But when you go into a news website and you kind of look at what trackers are on that site, there's usually between 5 and 50 different trackers that follow you, right? And you might know Google and Facebook and maybe a few others, but you probably don't know the other 48 third-party companies you've never heard of that are keeping a very close record of what you're reading and where you're going after you read that. The same is true for mobile apps, being tracked there. But even when you go to the store, right? Like stores are trying to figure out how they can not just track your purchases. If you have a loyalty card with your grocery store of choice, right? you're basically giving them the right to mine your purchases and figure out what things do you frequently buy together, and they use that to target to you. But they're now also trying to track which aisles are you in, right? When are you stopping in front of what kind of products? And while there are definitely business cases for why that's important and reasonable, right? Like you want to better understand how you can optimize your business, a lot of this happens without people really being aware that that's going on. Right? They get the loyalty cards because they get the 5% discount or get a nice offer once in a while. And this keeps continuing as we're bringing more smart technologies into our homes, as we're bringing more smart technologies in our cities, more sensors and cameras and other things. And often what we see is that you are the product, right? And that's, I'm sure like everyone here has heard this before, like, oh, if it's free, you're the product, right? So I thought I'd just show you what that actually means, right? So this is, I went to the Facebook ad manager yesterday and created an ad campaign. I didn't actually launch it, but I thought I'd just show you the targeting options. So what we can, sorry, I need to be next to the microphone. So I thought, let's go to Southfield. Is this working? No. Let's go to Southfield, and let's only show this ad to people in the range 18 to 23 years. I assume that's kind of the age of your students here. And then, we also want people who are at Lawrence Tech. And then we can do interesting targeting things like, oh, only show it to people who returned from travel in the last 2 weeks, right? Or only people who are living away from home. Right? So these targeting options are very, very detailed and fine granular. And you're being not just targeted to, and like, oh, I clicked on this website, but also behaviors you would not necessarily associate with Facebook or other companies knowing. This is Facebook's example because it's easy to go there and just create an ad campaign and look at it. All the advertisers are very similar in that regard. What we also see is something called custom audiences, which is also something most people are not aware of, right? So when you go to a coffee shop or to a store, and you give your phone number or your email address, right, so you can get that newsletter, that company can actually then use that data, upload it to Facebook, and then start advertising to you on Facebook, which might be nice, right? Like, oh, you're actually getting deals from your local restaurants or coffee shops, but it would probably be nice if they would be asking you first if that's actually what you want. Still better than the whole data broker industry, which, we talked about these other 48 trackers that are on the news website, and they basically sell and buy information about individuals and sell companies what's called data enrichment services, right? So give me one piece of information about an individual, I have lots more information you can buy from me. And I guarantee you have not heard of these companies. Well, okay, sorry, some of you might have, but if you study them, but most people have not. All right, okay. Well, Florian, that's great. Now you kind of ruined my evening. But what's the problem here, right? Like, why is this such a big deal? Like, okay, yeah, some data about you is being leaked. It's all just used for advertising. Well, let me give you a couple of examples. One is unwanted disclosure, right? People you may not even realize are learning information about you can access very detailed and personal information. You can pay about $300 to track a phone, trace a phone's location. Right? You might say like, oh yeah, if a bounty hunter is using that to catch a criminal, good for them. Not so great when it's an abusive spouse. Right? We see law enforcement and immigration enforcement increasingly use social media to surveil immigrants, blanket surveillance, because you're from a foreign country, you must be up to no good, but also domestically, right? Like when in 2020, when there were the Black Lives Matter protests, police and the FBI extensively used surveillance techniques to monitor protesters. And we've also seen how this data is used to influence political elections, right? So you may have heard about the Cambridge Analytica incident, in which a researcher exfiltrated millions of Facebook profiles from Facebook and then sold this information to a company called Cambridge Analytica. And what they used this information to then create targeted ads that targeted specific psychological profiles of people and basically show different people very different political messages, but always with the same purpose of getting people to, whatever the candidate is they're supporting. This has been used first by Ted Cruz. It has been used in the Trump election campaign. It has also been linked to the Brexit vote in the UK that created real-world consequences economically for the UK and many others. On the more personal scale, we also see discrimination play out, right? There can be age discrimination, gender discrimination, discrimination based on race. Pricing discrimination is usually a pretty typical example, but also kind of just the types of ads people are seeing. There's work that shows when you type in a black-sounding name into a search engine, you get ads for bail bonds and things like that. If you type a white-sounding name, you get job ads, right? So it also perpetuates racism in really, really bad ways. Privacy and inequality are also linked in interesting ways. If you're poor, be prepared to give up more of your data, right? Like if you want access to government benefits, if you want to keep your children, you're going to be asked for information. The more information you give up, we know this from over-policing, the more issues are found as well, right? Privacy invasions can have real consequences. And some of these I talked about are very direct, right? Like you actually feel and see those consequences. But that's not always the case. Often, privacy harms our absence of opportunity. You may never know that you didn't get this job interview because some algorithm picked up a social media post you made 10 years ago and has decided you don't fit the culture of this company, right? Amazon had big problems with that when they used algorithms to screen their applicants, and lo and behold, most women were just auto-rejected because they didn't fit the company culture, which was mostly male-dominated. All right, so lots of concerning things. And when you ask people, are you concerned about how companies or the government are using your data, people say yes, right? This is data from a 2019 nationally representative survey conducted by Pew Research Center. But what I've seen in my research and what others have shown as well is that while people are concerned, they're often not actually taking action, right? Like they're still using all these companies and the technologies. Now, some people in the field call this the privacy paradox. They're like, oh, people say they care about privacy, but look, they don't, right? They still use all these technologies. And I don't think of it as much as a privacy paradox, and rather as a fallacy of revealed preferences, right? Behavior is not always a good indicator of what people's actual preferences are. There are all kinds of other aspects that shape behavior. And we're going to talk about some of them. And in my own research, we've been looking at, well, is this really the case, right? Are people really struggling to protect their privacy? And we've been doing research with what I call exposure-sensitive populations, special populations that have a heightened risk to protect their privacy, because if they don't protect their privacy, there are potentially severe consequences. Right? So we've conducted research with undocumented immigrants, where talked with them about their risk perceptions and how they use technology and how they perceive risks in the technology. And what we found is that in their daily lives, they have very sophisticated risk avoidance strategies. We talk to people who never drive a car because they can't get a driver's license, and they're worried about traffic stops. We've talked to people who told us they never leave their children home alone because they're worried about ICE raids, never seeing their children again. ICE being immigration enforcement. Right, but when it came to technology use, they struggle like everyone else in having the benefits of the technology and trying to limit who can see their data in meaningful ways. In a very different context, we conducted research with sex workers in Europe, in European countries where sex work is legal. And what we found there is that they rely on technology for their business, but they also want to use technology to connect with their families and friends and other things. But companies like Facebook and other platforms in trying to, make as many connections as possible ends up recommending clients as friends or to their, recommending their clients to their partners. Or some people have a work profile and a personal profile, and all of a sudden their family is getting their work profile with, not safe for work content, let's put it that way. We also, even people who really have an interest in trying to limit their exposure in meaningful ways of controlling it are struggling. Why are people struggling so much to protect their privacy? Well, it's this great paper by Alessandro Acquisti and colleagues that appeared in Science in 2015, which boiled it down to 3 aspects. One is uncertainty. And uncertainty means people are uncertain about what data collection and processing is actually happening, what data about them is being collected, who's collecting it, how is it used. But there's also uncertainty about the risks, right? Like, it's one thing of knowing, like, oh, this data collection is happening. It's another thing to actually be able to then also understand what are the risks that are associated with it. The next is context. Privacy preferences are very context specific, right? So, and you might all know this yourself, like when you talk to a colleague at work, you might talk differently with them than when you have a drink with them in the bar or something, right? Like, that's just human function. We take context into account to determine how we reveal information. And then finally, privacy, because there's so much uncertainty, it's so context specific, you can actually manipulate people in giving up more information than they want to in very easy ways. I'm going to talk a couple of those. I'm going to be talking about a couple of those. All right, so first thing, we talk about uncertainty. Who here has read a privacy policy in March 2022? Who has read a privacy policy any time in 2022? All right, one person. Who has read a privacy policy since the beginning of the pandemic? Okay, couple of people. Yeah, most people don't read privacy policies. You're in great company, right? Like, don't worry. I teach a privacy class. I taught it this morning. More hands go up there, but it's kind of like occupational hazard, I guess, that they have to read privacy policies. Most people don't read privacy policies, and there are many good reasons not to, right? For one, it takes too much time. There's a great paper by Alicia McDonald and Laurie Craner from 2008, and they tried to estimate how long would it actually take people to read all the privacy policies of the websites they visit in a year. And they came up with this number, 244 hours to read all the privacy policies. Now that's in 2008. The iPhone was just coming out, right? We didn't have apps. Now we have mobile apps, we have smart speakers with third-party skills, right? I don't know what other smart home gadgets you might have in your home. You have smart cars, we have self-driving cars, right? The number of policies you would have to read today is probably much, much higher, and the policies are longer. Or, maybe there's a little bit more consolidation that has happened since then, who knows? Even if you try to read the privacy policy and you take the time, you might not understand it. The New York Times in 2019, as part of their privacy project, did this really great interactive visualization where so these blue dots are privacy policies. They highlighted Facebook, I didn't. But they basically looked at the 150 most visited websites in the US, and they used readability metrics, some kind of statistics to analyze how readable the text is, to chart the readability of these privacy policies. And then they compared some works of literature to it. So you can see that Facebook's privacy policy is just a little bit harder to read than A Brief History of Time. If you're not familiar, that's Stephen Hawking's book about the space-time continuum. Granted, he was very good at writing for a general audience, but it's still physics, right? Like, I don't know that Facebook's privacy policy needs to be harder to read than that. But hey, it's not quite as hard as the critique of Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason, right? But you can see there's still policies all the way up there, right? So that's a problem. And in 2018, 2019, we conducted a study where we looked at, so if GDPR stands for the General Data Protection Regulation. It's a big new privacy law in Europe, and it went into effect in May 2018. And I together with a group of German colleagues, we looked at the top 500 websites in each European country, and we monitored them over multiple months to see, like, oh, you know, how does the introduction of the GDPR actually change the privacy on the web? And what we found is that for these over 6,000 websites we looked at in total, that the average privacy policy was 3,404 words long after the GDPR went into effect. And that's 42% longer than 2016. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? It's probably good that companies are being more detailed and more comprehensive in what they're disclosing. But we need to stop pretending that's actually something a consumer is going to read, right? Like, these privacy policies are written by corporate lawyers for lawyers and regulators, and those are in conversation, but the consumer is not being informed by these policies. And we see this in other contexts as well. So this is an example. In 2019, Bloomberg revealed first that Amazon and then all the other smart speaker makers as well had employees listen and annotate to voice commands. Now, at this time I was talking to reporters a lot, and the question was always like, oh, you know, shouldn't people expect that that's the case? Well, it depends. If you have a degree in and knowledge in artificial intelligence and in machine learning, you might have a pretty good sense that if you want to disambiguate, if you want to improve your speech recognition, you need to disambiguate ambiguous samples. And humans are pretty good at doing that, right? Like, we're really good at picking up the context with very little input signal. But you know, it's very difficult to get that from the disclosures. And I'm just quote here the FAQ. The privacy policy just says, we may use data we collect about you to improve our services, right? That's very opaque, very difficult to get to, like, oh, someone's going to listen to what you say to your smart speaker in your bedroom at 2 a.m. in the morning, right? This is from the FAQ, and it says, like, well, we use your request to Alexa to train our speech recognition and natural language understanding systems. It's a little clearer, but you still need to make that jump. Like, oh, that means a human might actually be listening to what I'm saying to the smart speaker, right? And I would argue even someone who is trained in computer science in this area, it takes a moment to make that step from this statement, right? Particularly if it's in a long text where lots of other things are being disclosed as well. So what do we do about all of this? Yeah, that's kind of what we do, right? Like, people are just resigned. It's like, man, like I don't know how to deal with all of these problems. I don't like it, but I also like using the technology. And Nora Draper and Joe Turow term this digital resignation, right? People accept that their privacy is being invaded, but not because they are like all in and they like it. They kind of close their eyes and hope for the best, right? And are not particularly happy that their privacy is being invaded that way. But it's the only way to use the technology. All right, and we haven't even gotten to how we can change people's behavior in fun ways, right? So what has emerged over the last decade is a whole slew of dark patterns. Has anyone here heard the term dark pattern before? Okay, one person back there. So a dark pattern comes from, well, design patterns are good practices you want to reuse over and over again. Originates from architecture. It's very fundamental to software engineering, right? Like, you're trying to find a solution that works for a problem, you generalize it, and you keep applying it again and again. Well, dark patterns are the opposite, right? Like these are psychological tricks, things that manipulate people in ways that work over and over again, and companies keep using them. And if you want to dive deeper, the Norwegian Consumer Bureau, I'm not going to try to pronounce the actual name, but they have a great report in English, Deceived by Design, from a couple of years ago that has screenshots and documents a lot of these dark patterns. Well, again, with my collaborators in Germany, we conducted a study together with a German e-retailer, and they were kind enough to let us experiment with their consent notice. I'm not sure they talked to their lawyers before they had said yes to that. But the text was always the same. And we tried different things. We were kind of curious, like, well, how easy is it actually to manipulate people? Well, we didn't frame it that way, but we wanted to see how different aspects of the notice affect how people interact with the notice. And what we found is that just where on the screen we placed the notice had a significant impact on how many people interacted with the notice in the first place, and then also clicked accept. Right? So I'm going to see if you can see my mouse. Yes, you can. So if you look up here, right, if I show the notice in the top right corner of the screen, hardly anyone interacts with it. Blue means no action. People didn't do anything with it. But if I put it at the bottom left corner, oh, look at that. I actually get 18% to agree to my privacy notice. Right? It's the same notice, was visible to everyone. So just where I show it on the screen has a huge impact on how many people say yes. Right? But we can do more. We can use what's called active enhanced choice, and we just highlight the button we really want them to click, which is the accept button, right? And that gives us a couple more percentage points, right? And it's also significant. So, and this trick, and I think it's a trick, also works if you just have an accept button in the notice in the first place, right? If you highlight the button, more people click the accept button than just click the notice away or close it. Right? So what you end up with is with basically arbitrary consent rates. You have higher consent rates, but the consent is meaningless because it's not really freely given. Right? Like I can, by just deciding where on the screen I show this notice, we did other things where we looked at, what if you pre-select certain things and so forth. How you present these choices has a huge impact on what people actually do and what they agree to, right? So one of the takeaways here really is like, if we want to have more effective policies, it's not enough to say you need to give people consent options. We also need to say what these need to look like in a more standardized way. And then we've also found in research that often privacy controls that exist and look like they would give choices don't actually meet users' needs. We did a study with smart speakers, and we found that, I don't know if we can see this, but up here there's a little mute button, and it's a microphone with a dash through it. When we asked people what they think it means, they thought it would mute the speaker and turn off the sound, so they would never use the button. Right? And then also, if you wanted to interact with any of the privacy features, you had to go physically to the device and press the button, and you definitely forget to turn it back on. Well, there could be a voice command, right? Mute the speaker for the next 10 minutes. That would probably work as well, but that would make it maybe too easy to use these privacy functions. And then even when these privacy controls exist, they're often very hard to find. We did a study where we asked people to look for different opt-out choices, opt-out of email communication and a couple of other things. And depending on where those were placed, so you can see the gray bars are kind of the optimal from the home page to get to this. How many clicks do you need? How many interactions do you need? And then the blue ones are our participants. How long did it take them to find it? Right? And if the choices are hidden somewhere in the policy text, there are like 57 interactions before they finally find it, because they're just not in places where people would look for them. All right, so what do you think? Is technology killing privacy? Doesn't look good, right? But there's a bit of hope, right? Like, I think one of the reasons why I'm here today when talking to you is because privacy issues have been more in the spotlight in recent years. And we are seeing increasingly new privacy legislation, general data protection regulation in Europe. California in 2018 adopted a comprehensive privacy law. Comprehensive means compared to the sectoral federal law where you have like one type of protections for health data and one type of protections through FERPA for educational data, and then many other areas where you don't really have effective protections. Brazil has a new privacy law. China just adopted a comprehensive privacy law. And in the US, on the state level, we have so much activity around privacy laws. Just last year, Virginia and Colorado adopted privacy laws. A couple of weeks ago, Utah, the legislature passed a privacy law that is being waited to be signed into law by the governor. Right? So there's a lot happening in terms of privacy legislation. There's also a lot of lobbying to make sure that these laws are as weak as possible. we see a lot of more oversight activity, right? Like we all hear about these hearings when Mark Zuckerberg and the other tech CEOs have to go to Congress and explain how cookies work and other things. But at least there's interest, right? Like I think that's the important takeaway for me, even though what comes out of those hearings sometimes a little questionable in terms of its practical effect. What does have an effect is enforcement. And so in 2019, as a response to the Cambridge Analytica incident, the FTC imposed a $5 billion fine against Facebook. That was the highest fine the US government has ever levied against a private entity. Right? $5 billion. It's a drop in the bucket for Facebook. Right? They had a $55 billion revenue the year before. Should it be higher? I'm not sure, right? But it's like this. There's a clear asymmetry. One of the things that got a little bit overlooked in this consent decree is that they also instituted a compliance system for Facebook that actually requires that makes the CEO like directly responsible for adherence to the consent decree. So there are some additional measures, and the FTC likes to work like that. They hand out fines, but often they impose, for example, like 20-year-long audit requirements on companies. In Europe, we are seeing the different regulators kind of step up and start exploring the potential of the GDPR fine. So under GDPR, companies can be fined up to $20 million or 4% of global turnover, whatever is higher. And here are like the 3 largest GDPR fines that have been issued so far. So they're kind of like more and more getting willing to really levy these large fines. I think we're going to see many more of those in the future. All right, so there are increasingly reasons why companies are actually interested in designing for privacy. Legal requirements, limiting their liability. Some companies also just want to do the right thing. Not that many, I think, but sometimes I talk to people in companies that do, and I'm very heartened by that. But many reasons. So let's talk a little bit about how we can actually do better. And it starts with what information do we provide to people, right? We all just did this mini experiment here. Privacy policies are not cutting it. People are not reading it. They're useful, particularly for regulatory purposes, right, and for enforcement, but they're not useful for informing consumers. So instead, we need to make sure that information we give to consumers is actually relevant. So in our research, for example, we conducted this study where we showed people a fitness tracker. It's a Fitbit at that time. And we asked them we gave them a series of statements and asked them, do you think the device actually does this? Some were true, some were fake, right? Like whole slew of different data types that are being collected or shared, all kinds of other practices. But one of the things that sticks out with this experiment is that for certain information types and data practices, almost everyone expected that they would be happening, right? Like 94% thought, yeah, if I buy a fitness tracker, it's going to collect step counts. That was the main function of these devices at that time. But only a third of the participants also anticipated that it would collect location information. Now, if we have these results, right, and it's not very hard to do, like as a researcher, I can do this for a few $100s pretty effectively. Companies have bigger research budgets, right? You can actually use this type of information to then decide, well, maybe we should highlight these unexpected practices, make sure people are really aware of them, or we might also consider maybe we make location collection something that needs to be turned on, right? And we can have a dialogue and explain that, and that way reduce surprise about the practice. The second thing is that we need to make this information understandable, right? Like reading about your privacy and how your data is being used shouldn't be at the same level as reading a physics book, even if it's written by Stephen Hawking. And there are actually positive examples of how to do privacy notices better. Has anyone seen something like this before? Okay, so your bank should be sending you this every year. It's called the GLBA, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, required financial institutions to send out privacy notices on an annual basis. And they have to do it in this template, which is 2 pages long, definitely does not have 3,000 words, and it tells you about what data is being collected, why is it being collected, and what you can do to limit that sharing of the personal data. There was user testing with this notice. as a human-computer interaction person, I think there's still room for improvement here. But I think it's important to see that privacy notices don't have to be 3,000 words long, right? Like you can actually have this in a much more compact and meaningful way. And you see companies kind of toy around with that as well. This is Apple's privacy labels, which they introduced in the App Store in 2020. And they allow you to see what data is linked to you by a company, by an app, and what data is used to track you. And then they also give you choices to prevent tracking, for example. Now, has anyone seen those in the App Store? Yeah, they're still not putting it really in front and center, right? Like it's not what sticks out to people. But it's a step in the right direction, right? Like privacy information doesn't have to be these long texts. And then when we give people information about that affects their privacy, we also need to give them some choices so they can do something with it. And a really good example are mobile permissions, right? So when you install apps, they actually ask you in the moment, hey, this app wants to access your location, and you can say no. Or more recently, Apple required apps to ask you if the app can track you, and people are saying no, and it's having an effect on companies' bottom line. The important thing here for me is that it has also changed how these apps are communicating about their data practices. Now they are actually, before they show this permission dialog, they explain why they want access to your contacts or your location. And if you say no, they tell you how that impacts the functionality of the app and what you can do to, if you change your mind. And this is what privacy is all about. Let's have a respectful conversation between the consumer and the company, rather than just, taking whatever data is possible and hoping the consumer doesn't find out. And then having more usable controls is also helpful. I don't want to claim Amazon did this because of our research, but after our research came out, not too long after, they started introducing voice commands for privacy, such as you can tell your Alexa, delete everything I said today. Delete what I just said, right? And that's a nice way of integrating privacy into the user experience. And in my work, one of our contributions has been this, mapping out the design space of where can you actually put privacy notices into products, what are different timings that work, does it have to be on the same device or through a different channel, what are the modalities, right? It doesn't all have to be text. Can you have audio signals or even machine-readable information about privacy that then devices can interpret, for example, for smart home or IoT devices? And how do you integrate the controls? And this design space has since been adopted by companies all over, and it's I think it's a useful way of kind of giving us a vocabulary to think more creatively about, well, where do we put these privacy controls? All right, and then there's lots of other things we can do to actually support people in making privacy decisions. So we did this study where we showed people what we call a privacy nudge. Right, so we sent them this message. This message just appears on their phone. It says, hey, did you know your location has been shared 5,398 times by the following companies? Do you want to change your privacy settings? And what we found is, in a field study, that this information was enough for people to switch away from their primary task and actually go start interacting with the privacy controls and make changes. And we can even go further, and we can also analyze the code of the application and determine where is this call for location data coming from. Right? If it's coming from a third-party library, with some accuracy, I can tell you, based on what library it is, oh, this is likely being used for advertising or for profiling. Right? And that way give people a bit more additional information to make decisions. In other work, we've tried to make privacy policies a bit more useful and usable. And we built this deep learning system that analyzes privacy policies and allows you to ask free-form questions about privacy policies. We actually implemented this in a chatbot, so you can go to pribot.org and you can start chatting with our bot and learn a bit more about privacy policies. Now, we're limited by what's in the privacy policy, right? So it's not like all of a sudden we can give you much clearer content, but we can at least point you to the right place in the privacy policy. In other work, we looked at links and policies and classified which of those are actually opt-out links and built a browser extension that you can have installed in your Chrome browser or wherever. And when you go to a website, you just click on it. You can see all the opt-out links, and then it's much easier than going through all these additional steps I presented earlier. We can also better build privacy in how systems just work and interact with us in the first place. With smart speakers, one of the big problems is that you have false activations, and then like all kinds of conversations are being recorded that were never meant to be recorded. So we thought like, well, you know, when we have a conversation with people, there are different interaction cues we use to determine when we actually want someone to listen to us, right? So one is, I look at you, right? You know, I'm talking to you, and then you're hopefully listening. You were before, right? And we implemented this in a prototype. So we used actually a camera sensor with, you know, privacy implications as well. Prototype, but only if you actually looked at the device would it turn on the microphone and start recording, right? In a different variant, we implemented a system that worked based on audio volume. So if you're talking quietly in front of the device, it can't hear you. But then if you speak up, right, if you're above a certain threshold, the speech recognition kicks in and actually works. And it just makes seamless interactions, right? Like we build privacy in how you interact with this device. There's no delay in how it works. It functions in practice. And it doesn't have to be hard to have privacy integrated. If we build privacy in, it also has to be on by default, right? So I mentioned earlier how Amazon introduced these speech commands. Well, the problem is, in order to use them, you need to go deep into your settings, Alexa settings, and turn them on in the first place. There's no reason why that has to be the case, except that they don't really want you to use them. They want to say we've implemented this, right? But we really only want a small percentage of people to figure it out. But I think what's helpful to think of privacy interfaces on these controls, not just as compliance exercises, but think of them as opportunities as a company, right? You can explain what you're doing and reduce the price that way. You can also explain what you're actually doing to protect the user, and that can build trust. Many companies are investing much effort and time and money in being compliant with these new privacy laws, but a lot of it is under the hood, and you never see it, right? Because they don't want to pull your attention to privacy. But there is maybe opportunity to rethink that as a conversation between the consumer and the company. And then if you start building privacy interfaces, and then I'm almost at the end here, it's also important to test what you do with users. Right? Don't just build something and think like, oh, it's going to be the best thing ever. You need to test it, right? Like, we're all, like when I talk to my class, right? Like we all know privacy issues. I'm the worst judge of what people actually need and do, right? Okay, I have some experience in that area, but you know, I still want to talk to people and figure this out. And just an example. So I mentioned the California Consumer Privacy Act earlier. One of the new consumer rights it introduced is the right to tell companies to not sell my personal information, right? And companies need to have, if companies make a profit based on user data, they need to have a link on their website that says, do not sell my personal information. And the law stipulated that that link could also be accompanied with an icon, which was not specified in the law. So we were like, hey, we do a lot of privacy design. Maybe we should, you know, try to design this icon. And together with colleagues at Carnegie Mellon and at Fordham University, we did exactly that. We went through what's called a human-centered design process, went from like a large array of different icons to this icon you see here. We user tested it. We wanted to make sure it's not ambiguous, right, or that people have the wrong assumptions when they look at this icon, and that it actually suggests to them, oh, if I click this, there might be something to do with privacy and privacy options. And we came out with this icon that had like the fewest misconceptions and seemed to generally work well. So we submitted a report to the California Attorney General's office in their comment phase, and they were like, oh, thank you, that's great. And then shortly after, they came out with draft regulations that had this icon in there. So it looks kind of like our icon, right? But not quite. So they changed a couple of things, and all of a sudden, it looks like an actual toggle button. right? And we, and also other people, were concerned, like, if you use that icon, aren't people going to think they've already opted out? So we conducted another user study. We compared it with our icon. We wanted to be fair, so we also changed the colors. So our icon was tested in red, and the other icon was tested in blue. And yeah, we found exactly that, right? Like, if you show people this icon, doesn't matter what color it is, they think they're already opted out, which is exactly the opposite of what you want people to take away from looking at this. Right, so just looking at these like minor interface changes can have a huge impact of how these controls are being perceived and used. And that can be used by companies to dissuade people from using it, but it can also mean we can make a lot of mistakes, and regulators can make a lot of mistakes if we don't carefully test these interfaces. Well, the story here continued that we sent another report in. They removed the icon from the next set of draft regulations, and after working with us, they had another set of icons they wanted us to test. We tested that as well. And then finally, in March last year, they actually adopted our icon, and it's now part of the law. And you can also download it and hopefully use it on the Attorney General's website. Right, so in the end, I think it's a success story for user testing, but also shows that if you don't do this carefully, there can be big problems. So is technology killing privacy? I would say only if we let it. Right, there's lots of opportunities to do better. And what I really want you to take away today is that privacy is worth protecting. Right? It's not security versus privacy. Privacy is one. It has a human value and a societal value. Technologies make it much harder to keep your privacy and introduce privacy risks that are often very difficult for people to anticipate. And people struggle to protect their privacy because they don't understand the data practices. The privacy preferences are contextual. It's very easy to manipulate people in giving up more data than they want. But we can do things to design for privacy, making information relevant, understandable, actionable, and embedding it into the user experience in meaningful ways. And with that, thank you for having me, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Florian. That was really very interesting. He'll be happy to answer some questions. If you don't mind coming down here and speaking in the microphone, so it's actually recorded in there. So anybody who wants to come up, first question.
I have two questions. The first has to do with what you think could be the possible advantages to redefining these huge instruments, corporations, as public utilities. It seems to me like your demonstration here about simply trying to come up with an icon illustrates how complex this whole process is made by trying to dance around the money-making interests of business. I'm not an anti-capitalist. It just seems to me that at some point, entities cease to be simple corporations, and they become, in some sense, essential to public life. And we know what we do with those kinds of entities. We turn them into public utilities because they're so important to the public in general. The second question I have, and I'll just shut up after this, has to do with you as an educator thinking about how to educate young people to be less gullible, a little less conditionable to the use of technology. I'm obviously an old person, so a lot of these things strike me as toys. They have less to do with necessity than with having been conditioned to buy them and need them. And I'm wondering what might be done, not at the college level, but much earlier,
Right.
to make children savvy to these questions. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, two great questions. I think the first one, the notion of public utilities is definitely something that's in the discourse around this topic, right? Like, oh, should a social media company or a search engine, should that be a public utility? I think the problem is, where do you draw the line? Right? Should Amazon be a public utility? Should Uber be a public utility? Right? Like I think figuring out where that line is something that is difficult, and I think it's also something legislators are very careful and worried about. You know, not even considering that many of them probably receive also you know, donations from these types of companies. So I think it's something to consider. I think a different concept that comes up a lot, which I feel like is maybe more actionable, is that of fiduciary responsibility. Right? So if you have data of someone, you need to actually use it in that person's interest. And I think that's a powerful idea. We haven't really seen that yet in any of the laws that are coming out, but it's something that's being discussed and considered. Regarding the second question, right? How do you teach literacy, really? Right? Like, how do you teach literacy about technology? I think that's a really challenging topic. I think I would caution a little bit with, you know, you said like, oh, some of these technologies seem like toys to you, and you know, like maybe in the 50s and the 60s, like people were riling like, oh, these youngsters and the rock music, right? Like, it sounds like noise, right? And I think many of us probably enjoy that music pretty well by now. So I think it's, whenever something new comes along, right? Like, there are some people who see value in it and others don't see value in it, and I think that's just an evolving process. Certain technology kind of like just falls off and gets forgotten, and other technology wins, right? Like, I don't know, 10 years ago, TV makers were trying to believe us that you really needed 3D movies in your home, right? And I don't know how many people are really still buying or using 3D TVs, right? So I think that's kind of like something that the market also regulates a little bit. In terms of how do you teach literacy, we've been doing research with children as well. Didn't talk about that today. Young children in particular, working with child psychologists, and what we see is that some of them are actually pretty tech savvy, right? And what helps them understand how the technology works is if there are visual cues in the interface. Like, you can talk to a 6-year-old and they can totally explain to you why they're seeing certain video recommendations on YouTube and what YouTube might have inferred about them, right? And they can actually reason about, like, oh, you know, maybe if I hide my gender or you know, click on more videos about cars, it's going to think I'm a boy and not a girl, right? Like, so these cues about, like, I watched this, now I'm seeing this other thing, is very helpful. What makes this difficult for privacy is that it's opaque, right? Like, it happens in the background, and they often had very simplistic models of how data flows might work, but also how surveillance might work, right? So we were asking, like, oh, you know, do you think this company can learn something about what you're doing and who you are? So, like, well, you know, the computer has a camera, but then, you know, someone would actually have to look through the camera to see me, right? Like while lots of data is being sent about you. So I think finding ways how we can have better visual cues that also make it a little bit more transparent about what data is flowing and how it's flowing could be powerful. And then I think it's with anything else, right? Like, recognizing that it's a need for education. Similar how we need to teach kids how do you interpret the news and how do you get balanced news sources, which I guess is not necessarily a solved problem, unfortunately. It's just something we need to invest in and need to find ways to teach this and teach kids. But I think having stronger regulation that also curtails some of these excesses in terms of what companies are doing with data is also necessary. I think just saying, like, oh, you know, the consumer or the kids just need to be better educated, it's putting a lot of onus on the individual, while it's these, like, huge companies that are just making profits of people's gullibility, as you said.
Any other questions?
I don't know how easy is it for you to go back to a previous slide, especially the one that deals with positioning on the screen.
Yes.
Where you kind of try to compare
Yes.
the effectiveness of the responses of the user. And I'm trying to relate to the explanation. Did you try to find an explanation? When I'm looking at it,
Yeah.
I'm tending to look like it's the golden triangle where the attention of the user and interaction with the screen. Did you try to kind of find an explanation to that?
Yeah, so we think one of it has to do with what parts of the website are being occluded. So if you have it more on the left side and you have it in the bottom, it might actually occlude content. Whereas at least like in a Western context, if it's in the top right, like maybe a couple of sentences, but it's probably not as problematic.
Studies on the eye tracking in terms of the attention.
Yeah, we haven't done that yet, but that would be an interesting direction to potentially go in. Yeah, I think our explanations so far relate to what's occluded by the website, our menus being occluded, things you might actually want to interact with.
I'm curious if you've done anything with generations and privacy, because I read an article about how students today, young students, 20s, they've had exposure to reality TV all their lives, and they've had social media, and so they're used to this idea of being seen and being viewed and all of that, and that is not something that somebody that grew up in, I'm a little bit older, and so that to me seems it's not as day-to-day norm, and I'm sort of wondering, do you think we've all gotten used to this because it's a trade-off for technology, or do you think that there's different levels based on age and generation?
Yeah, I have not done research on this directly. We've done research with older adults and kids, so we've done the spectrum, but we haven't done kind of generation comparisons. I think like reality TV and self-representation, right? I think we see this play out in social media a lot, and there was this Facebook whistleblower last year, and reports of how Facebook knew the impact of Instagram on teenagers' self-image, right? It goes all back to theories of self-representation and how feedback loops reinforce certain aspects and other things. I think the big difference to me between self-representation issues and being seen is that's often very explicit, right? Like you curate yourself in certain ways, but a lot of the things I talked about today happen in the invisible, right? And they only function and work because not enough people know about it, so not enough people get upset about how they're being tracked and on a daily level. Yeah.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
How does your behavior differ when you're browsing compared to somebody who doesn't know as much as you do?
Yeah. So I guess you're asking what can we do to protect ourselves a little bit, right?
Actually, I wanted to know more about
Yeah, sure. I think there are two answers, right? One is it's challenging, right? Even for someone who knows what the risks are to make really informed decisions. Often, I think I'm probably more aware of what I'm potentially giving up when I'm using technology. And then when I use the web, I use an ad blocker. I block trackers. Right? Yeah. So I think that's a good way. And then just being careful like who you give your data to. I do read privacy policies. I don't read them front to back, but when I think a good rule is if you're opening a new account somewhere, right? Especially if it's potentially valuable, financial account, might have sensitive data. Read the fine print, right? Get a sense of what's actually in there. The other thing is, I think I actually have a slide for this. Oh, let's see. I have given a similar presentation before, so some things you can do, right? I think in general, asking yourself, are you the product, and what does it mean, and are you comfortable with being the product, right? It doesn't mean, I think making informed privacy decisions does not mean you have to throw all technology away and live in a cave. Right? It means you're making informed decisions about what you're comfortable with and what you're not comfortable with. And certain things you might not have a say in, but maybe you can call your representatives and let them know that you're unhappy with what the tech companies are doing. But I think often, so psychology research shows, like if you ask people with enough authority, right, like they give you whatever they want, whether you want that or not. So just asking why is really useful. Like, I don't need to give stores my phone number, right? Like there's just no reason to do that, just because they ask at the register. But I don't know when the last time was you were in a physical store, but like if you look at it, right, people are like one after the other, just give out their phone numbers. It's like, no, don't do that. It's bad for your privacy. It's also really bad for identity theft risks. And if you have to give out your information, fake it, right? Like unless you really care, give people fake information. And I think those are a couple of other things here, right? To just think about and keep in mind.
Okay, a couple more questions. Wind this up.
So do you think that we actually have an expectation of privacy anymore? I mean, it seems like everything we use is somewhere somebody can find it. Like we all use Gmail, doesn't that go somewhere else? That, like it's stored on servers that presumably, like my phone, I have the Samsung Galaxy, when I want to use text-to-speech, like a warning pops up if I want to switch from the Samsung keyboard, which is horrible, to the Google. It says, if you use the Google speech-to-text, it's not private.
Yeah.
So where is the expectation of privacy anymore? And thinking like the worst sort of draconian end of times sort of thought experiment, nobody has an expectation of privacy anymore.
Well, I think it depends, right? Like if I ask you right now, like what's your salary, what's your home address, other personal questions, you're probably not going to tell me, right? Especially not, maybe if you go drink a beer later, but not in this format, right? So I think in our social interactions, we very much have expectations of privacy, and we have a sense of what's appropriate information sharing and what isn't. I think what's happening in the interaction with technology is that we get conditioned to give up information, and the way these systems are built, the choice architectures are stacked against you actually being able to protect your privacy. Right? Like you're often kind of pushed into an all or nothing choice. It's like, well, if you want to use this service or this great phone and all its features, this is what you have to accept. And you're like, this text-to-speech is really useful. I think, okay, like I'm not comfortable with it, right? But it's not like I'm saying anything bad, right? Like that's often how people rationalize it. And so we say yes, right? And we forget about it because it's much more healthier for our brains to not worry about this all the time, right? So it's not so much that we don't want privacy. I think it's that companies just make it very hard to actually keep your privacy, and they do that on purpose. And what's been interesting to see is with the introduction of the GDPR in particular, which includes a provision for data protection by design and by default. And so companies have an obligation under the GDPR to demonstrate that whatever they're doing is the most privacy-friendly way in how they can do this. A certain thing is you see companies actually thinking about this and implementing new things, right? So Google, for example, is moving from, like, we need all the data in our big data centers, and then we do the data crunching there, to federated learning, where they train machine learning models on the device and then send the trained model back instead of all the raw data, right? Companies are thinking about, like, well, this targeted advertising model, the way it's implemented right now, it's probably not going to survive in Europe because it clearly clashes with GDPR. So there's work on kind of thinking about how can we actually come up with more creative ways of solving this. So I think we're not going to solve it by people opting out all the time, right? Like I wish, no, I guess I don't wish that. That would be terrible work for everyone. But really by this regulatory pressure, leading to creativity and innovation in how we build privacy into systems, and still have the business case. So privacy by design as a concept was developed by N. Kavoukian, the former Information Privacy Commissioner of the state of Ontario, province of Ontario. One of her rules for privacy by design was it should be positive sum, not zero sum, right? Like we should be able to get the function we want while doing it in a privacy-preserving way. And that's hard, but it's possible in many cases. And I think that's where, because of this regulatory pressure, we're seeing more companies actually invest. We also see businesses creep up that offer privacy as a service. So I think there's some hope there. I don't know, I think I took your question in a different direction there.
That's exactly it. Yeah, I mean, the thing that also really scares me, because I teach HR, is if they're going to, you said you're part of health informatics, is if they use this, organizations use this information to discriminate. Like we already
Yes.
saw examples, and they're like, oh, we're not going to hire you because you've got a pacemaker and we're reading your scans,
Yeah.
and it's public.
Yeah.
Right, so I think the regulation is good, as you said, and it's going to create more opportunities for innovation.
Yeah, I think we just need meaningful guardrails of what's okay to do with data and what isn't.
My question pertains to losses of privacy both at government and end user level, and it takes a more technical and libertarian approach. Do you think open source, free and open source software
Right.
with transparency and encryption made default could have a meaningful impact on privacy in the future, or do you think it's relegated more to tech-savvy people and the general public won't be able to access the benefits?
That's a good question. I think it usually starts out with it's for the tech-savvy people, right? So one of the lighthouse projects in privacy is an open source project. It's called Tor, the Onion router. It's a way of it looks like a browser, but it allows you to use the internet anonymously with pretty good guarantees. Very few people use it, and the people who use it have a very specific use case, right? Like it's often dissidents, journalists, sure, also criminals, right? Using this type of software. That has not jumped over in the mainstream. Another good example is Signal, the mobile messenger Signal, which implements end-to-end encryption, and that's been pretty successful. But the protocol used in Signal was then also implemented by WhatsApp. And by WhatsApp deciding we're going to enable end-to-end encryption by default for all of our users, all of a sudden turned WhatsApp in the largest deployment of end-to-end encryption. Right? So by pushing open source development and pushing these projects, interestingly often with government funding, right? Like Tor, the project I mentioned earlier, is largely funded by the government. By keep pushing the envelope there, sometimes these projects jump over and actually find mass market adoption and really can have a difference. HTTPS encryption is another example, right? That nowadays when you go to a website, almost all of them are encrypted, and your communication with them is encrypted, which means other people who are on the same Wi-Fi as you can't read what you're looking at, which is great, right? And it just happens by default because companies are making smart choices, and it's kind of built in how the technologies work. So the same way how we can build privacy-invasive technologies, aspects into technology, we can also build privacy-friendly aspects in technology, and really, with very few switches, give privacy guarantees to a large number of people. So yeah, I think open source is a good start.
All right. So before we go, we want to give you a small token of our appreciation to Florian.
You need to enter all your information.
I have no idea what's in here.
Do you just need the last 4 digits of my social security number? Or thank you.
Make sure you sign the privacy thing.
Thank you, that's great.
But I want to thank, of course, all of you for coming. Without you being here, there won't be a lecture. And of course, I hope you'll keep coming in the future. We expect to have more of these, and always in person. And thank you again. And I want to really thank Florian for coming out here. When I saw his webpage the first time, I was so fascinated, and I told Tracy, we have to get this guy. So here we are, and it was a fantastic talk, really interesting, and we want to learn more and more about it. Thank you again, Florian.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's great to be here.